The probe died on a Tuesday. No one at the Galactic Council's deep-range monitoring station noticed for 11 minutes because the technician on duty was eating lunch, and because probes died all the time out in the outer dark, clipped by debris, cooked by radiation, simply worn out from the loneliness of watching nothing for decades. Technician Hans Sepp logged it as equipment failure and reached for another bite of his food. Then the backup probe sent its first reading. He put the food down. The backup was registering contacts, ship contacts. The number was climbing, 40, 60, 120, and it kept going up, and Hans Sepp sat very still and watched it, because in 17 years of monitoring the outer dark, he had never seen anything come from that direction. Nothing lived out there. Nothing had ever lived out there. The counter hit 1,000. The probe's display ran out of room for digits. Hans Sepp pressed the emergency channel with one hand. With the other, he pushed his food away. He wasn't hungry anymore. The council chamber of the Galactic Assembly sat on a neutral station at the center of 5 trade routes, chosen 3 centuries ago because it was equidistant from most of the major species and offensive to none of them. It was a practical building, not beautiful, the kind of place where decisions happened because decisions had to happen somewhere. Delegate Pavu had sat in this room for 9 years. He represented the interstitial worlds, small planets, minor species, the kind of political group that mostly existed to fill seats and dilute votes. He was good at his job. He was careful. But he had spent 9 years watching larger powers do what they wanted and learning to live with it. He was not living with what he was looking at now. The main display showed a trajectory line, clean, straight, starting from the outer dark and cutting directly toward a specific patch of space. A small, unremarkable system called Valkyrie, home to a gentle and quietly diminished species that grew medicines and kept records and had spent most of the last 3 centuries trying to recover from what the Keth Dominion had taken from them. The line did not curve. It did not slow. "How many ships?" Pavu asked. The analyst at the board hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. "We stopped counting at 4,000, the analyst said. "The instruments aren't built to handle." She stopped, started again. "We have never needed them to handle numbers like this." 4,000, the largest fleet action in recorded galactic history. The Keth Dominion's campaign against the More Collective 60 years ago had used 312 ships. "Who are they?" said a voice from across the chamber. Nobody answered. "Who are they?" the voice said again, louder with the frustration of someone who was used to being answered immediately. That was Chancellor Rockthal of the Keth Dominion. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of figure that filled a room without trying. He had been Chancellor for 20 years. He had never met a question that didn't eventually answer itself to his satisfaction. He did not like this question. "Hail them," he said. They hailed them. The fleet did not respond. They hailed them again. In on every standard frequency, in every major language, in the old trade tongue that even dead civilizations had used, in mathematical pulses that any spacefaring species should recognize. Nothing. The fleet moved on its heading, patient, unhurried, like a tide that did not care about the shore's opinion. "Equipment malfunction on their end," Rockthal said, "or a migration convoy, a generation ship group. Send a physical intercept and find out what they are." Pavu looked at the trajectory again. He looked at where the line ended. "They are going to Valkyrie space," he said. "I can see that," Rockthal said. "Do we know why?" "No," Rockthal said. "That is why we are sending an intercept." Pavu nodded. He looked at the line. He looked at the way it didn't curve, didn't search, didn't explore. It went directly to Valkyrie space, the way a hand goes to a scar it has touched 1,000 times in the dark. Like they already knew exactly where they were going, like they had always known. Pavu sat with that thought for a long time and said nothing else. On the Valkyrie homeworld, in a government ministry building that everyone else had quietly left, Elder Thessie sat at her monitoring station and watched the fleet's approach on a screen that was older than most of the junior staff had ever been alive. She was very old. Old enough to remember when the ministry building had been full of people working before the Dominion's long years of pressure. Old enough to remember the harbor. She called it the harbor in her own mind, though it had not really been one. There was no water. It was a flat plain at the edge of the third continent, and 300 years ago it had been covered in ships, broken ships, leaking ships, ships held together with emergency sealant and something that was not quite hope anymore. And the people who came out of them had been hollow-eyed and shaking, and there had been so many children. 40,000 of them, altogether, the last of a species. Tessie had been young then, a junior aide in the medical ministry. She had carried blankets to the harbor every morning for 6 months and had never once felt like she was doing enough, because there was nothing you could do that would be enough for 40,000 people who had lost everything. The Dominion had come afterward, angry. The Valkyrie had paid for what they did, who had spent a century paying in slow and deliberate ways. Trade restrictions, resource quotas, the quiet strangling of a civilization that had made the wrong choice, as the Dominion defined wrong. The Valkyrie had never said it was the wrong choice. Now Tessie sat in the empty ministry and watched the fleet that was coming from the direction those broken ships had gone. Her hands were very still on the desk. She was trying to understand what she was feeling. It was not fear. She knew fear. She had felt it many times during the Dominion years. This was something older than fear, something that existed before the word did. The fleet moved on the screen. Patient. Vast. She did not try to name the feeling. She just sat with it. The intercept fleet the Dominion sent was 41 ships. Not their full force. Rockthal was careful about not appearing alarmed, but more than enough to stop a convoy and demand answers. 41 Keth warships in tight formation was a message. It said, "We are the authority in this part of space, and you will identify yourselves." They moved to intercept in the Shara Corridor, a narrow band of navigable space between two thick asteroid fields, a smart place to force contact. The unknown fleet would have to slow or change course, or at minimum acknowledge. At the council station, Pavu watched the Keth intercept team signal on the secondary board. Then the signal stopped. Not disrupted, not jammed, not scattered by static or interference. Just stopped, clean and complete, like someone closing a door. Pavu stared at the blank readout for a long time. Around him, the chamber had gone completely quiet. "The 7th Armada is not responding," the comm officer said, his voice flat in the way voices went flat when they were working very hard not to sound frightened. "What happened to them?" someone said. Nobody answered. The unknown fleet had not changed course, had not slowed, was not showing any new energy readings, no weapon signatures, no expanding debris field, no emergency signals. 41 ships had simply stopped reporting. "Send another intercept," Rockthal said. His voice carried its usual flatness. But his aide, a quiet, precise woman named Vessel, who had worked beside him for 11 years, watched the line of his jaw and said nothing. "Chancellor," Pavu said carefully, "perhaps before we commit send another intercept." Pavu did not push further. And he watched the display. He watched the unknown fleet continue on its heading, unbroken and unchanged, moving toward Valkyrie space. He kept his thoughts to himself. There were several of them, and none of them were comfortable. The first transmission came 3 weeks after the fleet had emerged from the outer dark. They had reached the edge of Valkyrie space. The fleet had stopped there, stopped exactly at the border, not 1 meter past it, and held position for 6 hours. They were not drifting, they were holding, with the kind of precision that required active effort and clear intention. Then the transmission arrived. Text only. No voice, no visual, no identification codes, no diplomatic headers, none of the standard opening protocols the galactic community had used for 4 centuries of interspecies contact. Just text. In a dialect of old Valkyrie script so archaic that the translation systems needed 11 minutes to read it. "We are here to settle accounts. Please advise where you would like us to begin." The chamber read it in silence. Pavu read it twice, then a third time. Rockthal read it and said, "Accounts. What accounts?" Nobody answered him. Pavu was looking at the transmission's timestamp, then looking at the fleet's position, held patient and exact at the Valkyrie border. He was thinking about the old Valkyrie dialect, about how old it actually was, about how whoever sent that message had not written it just now, in the moment, looking up old words in a translation file. Someone had written that message a long time ago, had kept it. One had carried it across 3 centuries of dark space and had sent it the instant the moment was right. Not before, not after. The patience behind that hit Pavu like something physical. He sat down slowly. "Who are they?" Rockthal said again, his voice carrying something new in it that he was working to keep out. Something that was not quite the same as his earlier certainty. On the screen, the fleet waited. The answer did not come from the Council's analysts. It did not come from the Dominion's intelligence division, which had been working for 3 weeks and was very quietly not finding anything. It did not come from any of the major powers who had been running identification checks since the probe first stopped counting. It came from the Velkari archives, a young archivist on the night rotation, assigned to cross-reference the old dialect transmission with historical records, found it in under 40 minutes. Found it in a record so old that it had been stored in physical format and only partially transferred to the digital system. A harbor manifest, 300 years old. It listed names and numbers and the condition of each group that had arrived on that flat plain at the edge of the third continent. Species, human. Number of individuals, 40,247. Condition, critical. Notes, survivors of systematic extermination campaign conducted by the Keth Dominion Fleet. Requesting sanctuary, sanctuary granted. The archivist sat with this for a moment, then she sent it up the chain as fast as she could. The chamber, when the information arrived, made a sound Pavu had never heard from it before. It was not shouting. It was not the noise of debate. It was lower than that, more fundamental. The sound a room makes when everyone in it is recalculating the same thing at the same time and arriving at the same answer. Humans. He knew the history. Everyone knew the history. The way people know about things that happened long before they were born and far from anything that touched them directly. The Keth Dominion had moved against humanity 3 centuries ago. A small species on a small cluster of worlds. Not powerful, not considered important, deemed an obstacle to Dominion expansion plans. The campaign had been efficient. The worlds were taken. The people were... Gone was the word the histories used. Not dead, not destroyed, just gone, into the deep dark. The Dominion had not sent ships after them into unmapped space. It had not been worth the fuel, what the official history said. 3 centuries. Pavu looked at the fleet on the screen. 4,000 ships. More. The instruments still could not get a firm count. He thought about what 40,000 people became in 300 years. If they were committed enough, if they were patient enough, if they had nothing else to do and every reason to do it. He looked at the blank readout where the Dominion's 41 ships had been. He thought he was beginning to understand several things he had not understood before. Rockthal was standing at the front of the chamber, very still. His aid vessel stood behind him and to the side, and her expression was doing something careful and controlled. "They are a dead species," Rockthal said. His voice was steady. "They have ships, yes, more than expected. But the major powers of this council, while united could... Chancellor." Pavu kept his voice level. 41 ships entered the Shara corridor. We have heard nothing from them since. A system malfunction? Nothing, Pavu said. Not one signal. No debris. No emergency beacon from a single crew member on any of those 41 ships. Nothing. The chamber was very quiet. Rockthal looked at the display, at the fleet sitting patient and enormous at the Velkari border, at the clean, polite text of the transmission still visible on the secondary screen. He said nothing more. Pavu noticed that Rockthal's aide had been looking at her own small screen for the past several minutes with an expression that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that the difference did not matter much. He did not ask her what she was reading. He did not think he wanted to know. Hedernum. That night, there was no real night on the council station, only a scheduled dimming of corridor lights every few hours. Pavu stood at the viewport in his quarters and looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond what any instrument could show him, 40,000 people had boarded broken ships and gone into the dark 300 years ago. They had gone with nothing. He tried to imagine what you built in 300 years when you had nothing except the memory of what was done to you and the memory of one species that had helped you. When those two things were the center of everything. When your children grew up knowing both of those things as clearly as they knew their own names. He thought about 40,000 people becoming more, becoming a civilization in the dark, with no one watching and no one interfering. HFY with every year and every resource directed toward a single purpose. 300 years. He thought about the Velkari, about a small species that had done one thing, one act of shelter in a desperate moment, and had been made to pay for it slowly and deliberately for a century while the people they sheltered disappeared, and the Dominion's power made it clear that mercy had consequences. The Velkari had paid the price. They had never said it was not worth it. And now something was coming back from the dark. Pavu pressed his forehead against the cold viewport glass. Accounts, he thought. They said accounts, not revenge, not war, not justice even. Justice was a word with a lot of interpretations and a lot of room for emotion to blur the lines. Accounts. He thought about the old Velkari dialect, about a message written long ago and carried all this way and sent at exactly the right moment. He thought about the 41 ships and the clean, complete silence where their signals used to be. Someone has been keeping very careful records, he thought, for a very long time. And now they are here, and they know exactly where everything stands. The stars were very still outside the viewport. In the morning, everything would begin. Pavu stood there for a long time, watching the dark where they had come from, feeling the particular cold of understanding, something that you cannot undo. On the Velkari homeworld, Thessie received the translation confirmation at the same hour. She read it. We are here to settle accounts. She thought about the harbor. About 6 months of morning walks across a flat plain carrying blankets that were never enough. About a small boy who had pressed his face into her shoulder and held on with both hands and said nothing at all because there were no words for what had happened to him. She thought about what her people had paid for doing what they did. She thought about what it must have felt like. 40,000 people getting back onto their damaged ships and going into the dark, leaving the only friends they had in the entire galaxy, not knowing if they would ever come back, not knowing if the people they left behind would survive the Dominion's anger, carrying that uncertainty with them into the unmapped dark. She thought about what you hold on to when you carry something like that. She looked at her screen. 4,000 ships. Sarnit, the first thing they did when they came back was write in her people's oldest language and ask where she wanted them to begin. The feeling she had been carrying since the fleet appeared finally had a clear shape. It was not fear. It was not wonder. It was the specific feeling of someone who made a choice long ago without knowing if it mattered, and then lived for 300 years inside that not knowing, and then one quiet evening received their answer. Thessie sat in the empty ministry and let herself feel it completely. Outside the window, the city was ordinary. The evening light was ordinary. Somewhere nearby, a bird made a small sound in a tree. She pressed the reply key. She typed in the old dialect her grandmother had taught her, and in words she had not used in 40 years because no one spoke them anymore. Begin here. She sent it. She sat back. She was crying. She did not know when she had started. She did not try to stop. Outside, the city continued its ordinary evening, unaware that in a quiet ministry office, an old woman had just answered a question that had been waiting 300 years for someone to ask it. The fleet received her message. The fleet began to move. The shuttle Pavu took to the human flagship was a small diplomatic vessel, standard issue, the kind of craft designed to look unintimidating and neutral. It had comfortable seats, a small refreshment unit, and windows along the side that now showed him something his brain kept refusing to fully process. The fleet. He had seen the numbers, and he had stared at the instruments for 3 weeks. He had heard analysts read out figures that had no historical comparison, but numbers on a screen were one thing, and this was another thing entirely. The ships went in every direction he looked, not clustered, not crowded, organized, each one placed with clear purpose, the way a city is organized, where the placement of each building makes sense once you understand what the city is for. And they were not uniform. Some were enormous, the kind of scale that made the shuttle feel like an insect. Some were smaller, faster looking, built for different work. Some had shapes he did not recognize at all, designs that did not match any template in the council's records, built from 300 years of engineering he had never seen and could not evaluate. He sat at the window and watched them pass for 20 minutes and did not reach the end of the fleet. His aide, a young man named Daru, sat beside him and said nothing. Daru was usually very good at saying things. Pavu appreciated the silence. The flagship was not the largest ship in the fleet. That surprised him. It was large. It dwarfed the shuttle without trying. But it was not the biggest, and it had no obvious weapons visible on its exterior, which he found more unsettling than weapons would have been. A ship that showed its weapons was making a statement. A ship that didn't was not interested in statements. It was simply a ship that had come here to do something and did not need to prove anything to anyone. The docking process was smooth and automatic. The airlock opened. There was a human there waiting, a young woman in a plain gray uniform who said nothing dramatic and made no particular event of the moment, who simply said, in the common tongue, with a slight and unfamiliar accent, "Delegate Pavu, the Admiral will see you now." Just like that. The room they brought him to had no windows. Pavu had expected a command center, a war room, screens and maps, and the visible machinery of a 4,000-ship fleet. Something designed to impress and to show power. It was a plain room, a table, 2 chairs, lighting that was warm rather than harsh. There was a small machine on a side counter making something that steamed gently and smelled like nothing he recognized, but in a way that was not unpleasant. Admiral Soren Weil was already sitting at the table. She was not what he expected. He was not sure afterward. What he had expected, something harder maybe, something that looked like 300 years of building toward a single moment. She looked like someone who had been awake a while but was not tired. She was calm in the way that people were calm when they had moved past the part where calm required effort. She stood briefly when he entered, which he did not expect, and gestured to the chair across from her. "Delegate," she said. "Sit, please." She poured 2 cups of the steaming thing from the machine and set one in front of him. "You don't have to drink it," she said. "I don't know if it suits your biology, but it's warm, and this is a first meeting, and it seemed appropriate." Pavu sat. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "Admiral," he said, "I represent the Galactic Council. I need to ask." "You need to ask a lot of things," she said, not unkindly. "You've been trying to reach us for 3 weeks." You did not respond. "No," she said. "Why not?" She considered this. It did not seem like a difficult question for her, just one she was deciding how much to answer. "We had nothing to say to the council yet," she said. "We had something to say to the Valkyrie. We said it. They answered. Then we were ready." "Ready for what?" She reached under the table and placed an object between them. A ledger, physical, bound in something dark and slightly worn at the corners, the way things got worn from being handled regularly over a long time. It sat on the table between them, and it was the most ordinary-looking object in the room and somehow the most important. Pavu looked at it. "What is that?" he said. "An accounting," she said. "Of everything." She did not open it immediately. She drank from her cup and let him look at the ledger. He did not touch it. He was not sure he wanted to. "Every species in the council has an entry," she said. "Every interaction our people had with every species, going back to first contact and forward through today. Every kindness, every harm, every trade agreement honored or broken, every refugee taken in or turned away, every ship that helped and every ship that fired." She said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. Not proudly, not threateningly, just cleanly. "You have been watching for 300 years, Pavu said. "We have been recording," she said. "Watching suggests we were hidden. We were not hiding. And we were in the unmapped dark doing what our people have always done. Surviving, building, making something from nothing. And recording," he said. "We sent observers," she said. "Long range, patient. It is not difficult to gather information about people who do not believe you exist and therefore do not bother to conceal themselves from you." Pavu thought about that. He thought about the last 300 years of galactic history, all of it proceeding normally. No one thinking about the 40,000 people who had gone into the dark, all of the conversations and decisions and cruelties and kindnesses that had happened in open sight, in ships and stations and council chambers, while somewhere in the unmapped dark, someone was writing it all down. He felt the particular uncomfortable feeling of someone who has been observed without knowing it. The Valkyrie entry, he said. What does it say? She opened the ledger to the first page. He looked at the Valkyrie entry. He could not read human notation, but the structure was clear. A column of figures, entries, dates stretching across the page. At the bottom of the column was a number. Large, very large. 40,000 people, Vile said. Shelter for 6 months in conditions that cost your people significantly. Resistance to Dominion pressure at personal cost to the Valkyrie government. Medical care, food stores, material given freely. Then the accumulated cost to the Valkyrie people over the following century. The trade restrictions, the resource extraction, the systematic economic damage the Dominion imposed as punishment for what the Valkyrie did. She turned a page. We include that, she said. What it cost them to help us. What they lost because they helped us. That is part of the debt. Pavu was quiet. You include what was done to them because of you, he said. If you shelter someone and they bring you harm in doing it, she said, and you knew that was possible and did it anyway, then the harm is part of what they gave. Yes. Pavu sat with that for a long moment. The Valkyrie entry is at the front, he said. Yes, she said, because they are first. Because everything else in this ledger comes after them, she said. Everything we built because of 6 months on a flat plane at the edge of their third continent. That is the first entry, because it is the foundation of all the others. The room was quiet. Pavu picked up his cup and drank from it. It was warm and slightly bitter, and not bad at all. What does the council's entry say? He asked. She turned several pages and found it without hesitation. He looked at the numbers. He could not read them, but the column was not as long as the Valkyrie entry. It was not deep red, which he had begun to suspect might indicate debt, but it was not empty either. Neutral to modest positive, she said. The council provided passage to several human refugee ships in the early years, before the Dominion made its position clear. After that, the council stopped providing passage. The Dominion pressured. I know why, she said. It is still in the ledger. He nodded. That was fair. And he knew it was fair. You are not here to harm the council, he said. We are not here to harm anyone, she said. We are here to settle accounts. Those are very different things. And the Keth Dominion's entry? She did not turn to it immediately. She looked at him steadily. The Dominion's entry, she said, is in the back. She picked up her cup. There is a reason we put it in the back, she said. Pavu thought about the 7th Armada, about the blank readout, about 41 ships in complete, clean silence. He did not ask her to turn to the back. I want to be clear about something, Val said. We did not come here to fight. We have not been preparing for a war. Pavu looked at the fleet visible in every direction outside the ship. She understood what his silence meant. We prepared for the possibility of a war, she said, if someone chose to start one with us. That preparation took the same amount of time and resources as what we actually came here to do, which is settle accounts. The difference is that what we actually came here to do is almost finished. Almost, Pavu said. The Valkyrie repayment is large, she said. It will take time to deliver properly. We want it done correctly. What form does it take? She told him. He listened for a long time. His aide-de-camp, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, had stopped writing things down somewhere in the middle and was simply listening with his mouth slightly open. It was not weapons, not territory, not political leverage or military support, or any of the things that constituted power in the galaxy's current language. Fine, it was everything the Valkyrie had lost, calculated precisely, returned in full. Infrastructure, technology, biological and medical knowledge accumulated over 3 centuries of isolated development. Agricultural systems, energy architecture, educational materials, population support frameworks. You built all of this, Pavu said. specifically to give it to them. We built much of it for ourselves, she said. We are giving them the equivalent of what was taken. The equivalent, he said. How do you calculate? Very carefully, she said, and for a very long time. The room was quiet again. Outside, the fleet drifted in its organized calm. There is something I need to ask, Pavu said. The Seventh Armada, she said. He had not said it yet. She had known what the question was. Yes, he said. She held her cup in both hands. She looked at the ledger on the table between them. The Rockthal Seventh Armada, she said. 41 vessels. They intercepted us at the Shara corridor. Pavu waited. We have logged it, she said, in the ledger. She did not say which column. He did not ask. He thought about 41 ships and a blank readout and the clean, complete absence of anything afterward. No debris, no signals, nothing. He thought about a civilization that had spent 300 years in the dark, that had developed without anyone watching, that had sent long-range observers who recorded everything in a physical ledger with worn corners because it had been handled so many times. He thought about what 300 years of directed, focused, purposeful work looked like when it finally arrived. He did not ask which column. The meeting lasted 4 hours. When it was over, Vile walked with him to the airlock. She did not send an aide. She walked with him herself, through clean, plain corridors, past humans in gray uniforms who nodded at her as she passed and did not stare at Pavu, which he found remarkable, given that he was the first non-human many of them had likely ever encountered in person. They did not stare. They simply went about what they were doing, because there was work to do, and the work was the point, and everything else was secondary to the work. At the airlock, Val stopped. Delegate, she said, I want to say something not for the record and not as a formal communication. Pavu stopped. The council did not do nothing, she said. In the early years, before the Dominion made its position fully clear, there were small things, ships that looked away, authorities that processed transit documents very slowly and asked no questions, small things done by individuals at some risk to themselves. She looked at him. We know who they were, she said. Those entries are in the ledger too. Pavu thought about 9 years in a council chamber, about his own world's history, about whether his own people had an entry and what column it was in. We are not only here to collect debts, Vile said. The ledger works in both directions. She put out her hand, the human gesture, open palm, which he knew from cultural files but had never experienced firsthand. He took it. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely ordinary. We will be in touch, and she said. Well, he nodded and stepped through the airlock. In the shuttle, on the way back to the council station, Doru sat beside him for a long time without speaking. She knew about the Seventh Armada before we asked, Doru finally said. She had the name and the number already. Yes, Pavu said. She knew we would ask. She knew everything we were going to ask, Pavu said. She has known for a very long time what this conversation would look like. Doru was quiet. She poured you tea, Doru said. She poured something warm, Pavu said. She said she didn't know if it suited my biology. She still poured it. Pavu looked out the window at the fleet, at the vast and organized calm of it. The ledger, Doru said. Did you see, when she opened it, how worn the binding is? Pavu had seen. It has been opened a great many times, Doru said, over a very long period. Yes, Pavu said. People don't wear out a book like that unless they go back to it regularly. Not just for work, for something else. Pavu thought about that. A physical book, passed down through generations, worn at the corners from being handled. Not a digital record, not a database, not a file that you opened on a screen. A physical thing that you could hold in your hands. A physical thing that felt real, that made what was in it real. Every entry in it was a person, or a people, or a moment where someone made a choice in a crisis, and that choice was remembered. Pavu thought about the Velkari entry at the front, the foundation entry, she had called it, the one that everything else was built on. He thought about 40,000 people in broken ships and a young aide carrying blankets across a flat plain. He thought about what it meant to write something down and keep it and carry it for 300 years and handle it so often the binding wore out. It meant you did not forget. It meant you had chosen deliberately never to forget. Where are we going? Doru asked. Pavu looked at the fleet one more time. Back, he said. We need to tell the council what is coming. What is coming, Asarin? Daru asked. Pavu thought about the ledger, about the entries, positive and negative, every species in the galaxy waiting in those pages for their number to arrive. Their bill, he said. He turned away from the window. Or their gift, he said. Depending on what they did. The Galactic Council's emergency session lasted 11 hours. Pavu sat through all of it. He sat through the parts where people shouted. He sat through the parts where people pretended to be calm and were not. He sat through the long, diplomatic performance of several species who were clearly doing mental arithmetic about their own entries in a book they had never seen and did not know the precise contents of. He presented his report from the meeting with Admiral Vial. He read from his notes. He answered questions. Most of the questions were about the 7th Armada. He told them what Vial had told him, that the Armada had intercepted the human fleet at the Shera corridor, that it had been logged in the ledger. He did not tell them which column it was in because she had not told him, and he did not tell them his own conclusion about which column it was in because he was not yet ready to say that out loud in a room full of people who would react badly to it. He sat through 11 hours of the council trying to decide what to do. They did not decide anything. This was not unusual. The council frequently took multiple sessions to decide things. It had a process. The process was designed to ensure that everyone was heard and that decisions were reached with full consideration. The process was not designed for 4,000 ships already sitting in Velkari space, already beginning to do things. On the morning of the second day, 3 things happened at approximately the same time. The first thing, a human envoy arrived at the Ha'an homeworld. The Ha'an were a small species, unremarkable in most respects, known primarily for their medical knowledge and their strong cultural tradition of offering aid to travelers. 40 years ago, a human exploration vessel had been damaged by a debris field near Ha'an space. The Ha'an had found the ship. There had been 11 surviving crew members in poor condition. The Ha'an had brought them aboard, had treated them, had sent them on their way. No record of the incident existed in the Council's files because it had been a private act. One small species' natural hospitality, not worth documenting in official channels. The human envoy who arrived at Ha'an was young and polite and arrived in a small ship, alone. She met with the Ha'an Science Ministry and handed over a data package. The ministry spent 6 hours going through its contents. It was 3 centuries of human pharmaceutical research. Biology, chemistry, disease treatment, genetic medicine. Everything they had developed in isolation, translated into Ha'an notation, and organized clearly for easy use. Not a promise of future sharing, not a trade proposal. Delivered, complete, without conditions. The head of the Ha'an Science Ministry, a man named Vosara, who had spent 40 years working on 3 specific diseases that had resisted every treatment his people had tried, found in the package not just leads, but complete solutions, not partial solutions. Complete ones worked out in full. He started crying at his desk. His assistant asked if he was all right. He could not explain quickly enough what he was looking at, so he just said, "We have been trying to solve this for 40 years. And, his assistant said, "And they solved it," he said, 30 years ago. And then they brought us the answer. The assistant looked at the screen. "Why?" she said. Vosara thought about the story his grandmother had told him, about a damaged ship and 11 people, and a decision to help that had seemed very ordinary at the time. "Because 40 years ago we did something small," he said, "and apparently they do not consider small things unimportant." The assistant stood at the desk and looked at the screen for a long time. "Who are these people?" she said. It was not a frightened question. It was something else. Vosara was already reading the first solution document. His hands were not steady. "I don't know," he said, "but I am very glad they exist." The second thing that happened that morning, a human envoy arrived at the borders of Velnari space. The Velnari were a border species, medium-sized, competitive, with a history of territory disputes and a political culture that prized strength and decisive action. 100 years ago, during a confused and badly documented skirmish in a disputed zone, 11 humans had been killed by Velnari forces. The Velnari records listed it as a defensive engagement against unknown vessels in claimed territory. The human records, it turned out, listed it differently. The envoy was polite, professional. She met with the Velnari Border Council and presented a sealed document. The Border Council opened it. Inside was a bill, itemized, precise. 11 individual accounts, each calculated separately, with entries for each loss, direct harm, lost future contribution, compounded across a century. Then a second section, the cost to the families, to the mission, to the broader effort. It was not a large bill by the standards of the Han delivery or the Velkari repayment. It was a specific, measured, careful document. At the bottom was a line that said, proposed settlement options are as follows. The proposed settlements were all things the Velnari could actually do, resources they could provide, technology they could share, actions they could take, nothing impossible, nothing designed to humiliate. The Border Council sat with the bill for several hours. When the galactic press contacted them, word had spread quickly, the council spokesperson came out and made a short statement. We have received a document, she said. We are considering our response. A reporter asked what was in the document, and the spokesperson paused. It is fair, she said. She said nothing else and went back inside. The third thing that happened that morning became the most watched broadcast in the history of galactic communications. The Ha'an Science Ministry's Vosara gave a brief statement to a small regional news service that was not even particularly well known. He was not good at speeches. He was a scientist, not a politician. He stood in front of his desk with the data package still on the screen behind him and talked for about 4 minutes in a plain and slightly stumbling way about what had been delivered and why. He said that 40 years ago, his people had helped someone who was hurt. He said it had seemed like a small thing at the time. He said that apparently it was not small to the people they had helped. He said that what had been delivered to his ministry that morning would save lives, many lives, lives that would have been lost without it. He did not editorialize. He did not make it dramatic. He just said what happened. The broadcast reached the Galactic Council's main information network within 2 hours because a council staffer happened to see it and forwarded it. Within 4 hours, it had been picked up by every major news service in the assembly. Within 6 hours, it had been translated into every language the network supported. By the end of the day, the image everyone knew was the last 2 seconds of the broadcast, where Vosara finished speaking and looked down at his desk and then just stood there, breathing. And you could see in his face what it felt like to have 40 years of work resolved in a single morning because someone somewhere had written down a small act of kindness and never let it go. He wasn't performing anything. He was just standing there feeling it. The entire galaxy watched him feel it. The Keth Dominion's response to all of this was a series of press statements that Pavu read at his desk and set aside without replying to. The statements said various things. That the human presence was illegal under council transit regulations. That the technology transfers were a violation of standard intellectual property frameworks. That the so-called debt ledger was a unilateral document with no standing under galactic law. That the Dominion was prepared to take whatever steps were necessary to protect galactic order. Pavu set each statement aside. He noticed that the statements did not mention the Seventh Armada. He noticed that the statements did not say specifically what steps the Dominion was prepared to take, or how exactly they proposed to address 4,000 ships already operating freely in Velkari space. He noticed that each statement was slightly shorter than the one before it. On the fourth day, Chancellor Rockthal called an emergency meeting of the Dominion's military high command. Pavu knew this because Rockthal's aid vessel had sent him a quiet and carefully worded message, asking whether it was too late for the Dominion to put in a request for a bilateral meeting with Admiral Vale. It was the first time in 9 years that anyone from the Dominion had asked Pavu for help with anything. He forwarded the request to the human fleet's communication channel. He received an acknowledgement within the hour. The request has been logged. He passed this back to Vessel. He did not hear from her again for several days. On the 5th day, the Dominion's home system stopped responding. Not under attack, not blockaded. The shipping lanes around it were open. The communication channels were active. No one was interfering. The system just stopped reporting normally. The monitoring stations showed the 3 major inhabited Keth worlds. Then the monitoring stations showed something different where those worlds had been. Dispersed mass. Not explosive, not violent, not the reading you got from a destroyed planet. Just the orderly, quiet absence of what had been there before. Not like something had been carefully taken apart and redistributed. It took the Council's analysts 6 hours to confirm that no one had died. The Keth population, all of it, every person from all 3 worlds, had been relocated. To which worlds and by what method was not immediately clear. The relocations had clearly taken significant planning and significant time. The infrastructure was gone. The cities, the industrial complexes, the military production facilities, the administrative centers. Gone. Cleanly, methodically. Like someone had looked at the ledger entry for the Keth Dominion and decided that the settlement did not need to involve casualties, but also did not need to involve the perpetuation of the apparatus that had caused the harm. The council chamber, when this was confirmed, was not noisy. Hold on, it was the opposite of noisy. It was the silence of a large group of people thinking the same thing very hard and not wanting to say it first. Pavu said it. They relocated the Keth population before they dismantled the infrastructure, he said, which means the relocation was planned first, which means all of this, he gestured at the display, was the plan. He looked around the room. How long does it take, he said, to relocate an entire species? 3 species worth of population, all 3 Keth homeworlds, and do it without a single casualty? The room was quiet. Longer than 3 weeks, he said. Longer than the time since the fleet appeared. He let that sit. They planned the Keth settlement long before they arrived here, he said. They knew what the Dominion would do. They knew the Dominion would send the 7th Armada. They knew the Armada would intercept them. They had the Keth relocation already in motion before we ever saw their fleet on our instruments. The silence in the room was now a specific kind of silence. How long ago? Someone said. Pavu thought about a worn ledger. About 300 years. He did not answer. Rokthal's address to the galactic press was scheduled for that afternoon. He was 3 sentences into his prepared remarks when his communications director approached the podium and bent to say something in his ear. Everyone watching saw his face do something it had never done in public before. He stopped speaking. He stood at the podium for 4 seconds without speaking. Then he stepped back from it and walked off without another word. The communications director stared at the podium for a moment. Then she followed him. The press release issued later that day said the address had been postponed due to an administrative scheduling conflict. On the same day, the Dominion's 14 outer colonies filed simultaneously for Council Protectorate status. Pavu read the 14 filings in his office. They were almost identical in structure, which told him they had been prepared in advance by people who had expected to need them. He sat at his desk and thought about that. About Keth citizens on the outer colonies who had apparently been ready for this possibility, who had had the paperwork prepared, who had been watching the ledger numbers in their own way, with their own quiet calculation. Union had made their own decisions about what the arrival of the human fleet probably meant for the Dominion's future. He thought about what it meant that ordinary Keth citizens had seen this coming when their own chancellor had not. He filed the Protectorate requests and copied them to the relevant administrative departments. Then he sat at his desk for a while and thought about the difference between people who were afraid of what had happened and people who were afraid of what had not happened yet. The council chamber the following morning had a different quality than it usually did. Not louder, actually quieter. The kind of quiet where everyone has already had the argument with themselves and arrived at approximately the same position. Species representatives who rarely spoke were speaking. Several of them were asking procedural questions about the ledger, its legal standing, whether it was recognized, whether settlements reached through it were enforceable under council law. Pavu listened to these questions and understood what they actually were. They were not questions about legal frameworks. They were the sound of people trying to find out, without asking directly, what their own entry said and whether what was coming for them was a bill or a gift. We have not seen the ledger, said the representative of the Shavos Compact, a species with a long history of complicated relationships with almost everyone. We cannot respond to something we have not seen. I believe, Pavu said carefully, that you will be shown your entry when it is relevant to do so. By whom? The Shavos representative said. By the humans, Pavu said. On their schedule, the representative said. Yes, Pavu said. The representative sat back. They said nothing else, but they sat in a particular way that told Pavu the question was not resolved, just contained. That was how the whole chamber felt. Contained. Things held in and behind doors and not quite said out loud. He thought about the Velnari spokesperson. It is fair, said quietly as though surprised, as though fairness was not what had been expected and the surprise of it was hard to process in public. He thought about Vosara standing at his desk with 40 years of impossible problems suddenly resolved behind him. He thought about the Ha'an families who would live because of what had been delivered, about the specific diseases, about the complete solutions. The council chamber talked for 7 hours and reached no formal resolution. After in the corridor, a representative from a small species called the Mevin stopped Pavu. The Mevin were very small and very old as a civilization and very quiet in galactic politics. They had been around long enough to have seen things come and go. Delegate, the Mevin representative said. A question? Yes, Pavu said. The species that sent those 40,000 people away, she said, that exterminated their worlds and did not pursue them into the dark because it was not worth the fuel. Pavu waited. Do they understand, she said, what they made? Pavu thought about a physical ledger with worn corners, about a message in a dead dialect carried for 300 years, even about a fleet that held position exactly at a border and waited 6 hours for a reply before moving 1 meter into the space they had been invited into. No, he said, I don't think they did. That is the most terrifying thing you could have said, she told him. She went back into the chamber. Pavu stood in the corridor. Outside the station's viewport in the distance, ships were moving toward Velkari space. Human ships, carrying things, doing the work they had come to do, patient and quiet and entirely certain of what they were doing. Pavu went back to his office and sat at his desk for a long time before he could find a way to start his next report to anyone. They came in the morning. Not warships, freighters. The distinction was clear even to Thessie's aging eyes. The shape of them was wrong for combat. Was built wide and heavy rather than lean, built for carrying rather than fighting. Hundreds of them moving in a slow and coordinated line across the Velkari sky, holding formation with such easy precision that they looked like a single thing rather than many. Thessie stood at the window of the ministry building that had been her post for 60 years and watched them come in through the atmosphere. The younger government officials were gathered in the main hall, speaking to each other in low voices, doing the organizational work of receiving something this large and this unexpected. There were protocols being written on the spot. There were comm channels being opened and closed. There was the particular organized noise of a bureaucracy trying to adapt quickly to something it had not prepared for. Thessie was not in the main hall. Why, she was at the window. The freighters were descending now, spreading out over the landscape, each one moving to a specific position with the kind of deliberate placement that told her they already knew where they were going. Not searching, not circling. Each ship going to a specific place that someone had chosen in advance. She thought about the harbor again, about ships arriving on a flat plain. These were different ships, different people, different moment. The same thread, though, the same line running from then to now, 300 years long, and she was standing at both ends of it at the same time. She put her hand on the window glass. Outside, the freighters descended. The first thing they did was maps. Human engineers arrived at the Velkari government offices with physical map documents, printed, detailed, eyes showing the entire planet in sections, and spent 3 hours with the government's infrastructure coordinators going over every marked location. The marked locations were where things would go. Thessie sat in the back of the coordination room and watched this happen. She watched the human engineers explain their plans in careful, simply spoken, common tongue, pointing at the maps, answering questions patiently, never seeming frustrated when a question required a long answer. She watched the Velkari coordinators lean over the maps and follow the pointed fingers and ask more questions. One of the human engineers was very young, younger than Thessie's grandchildren. He had a scar along the side of his jaw, and he spoke with his hands a great deal. He was explaining the water system, not a water system that the Velkari would have to build themselves. A complete water reclamation system, the components for which were already on the freighters, already being positioned, ready for installation beginning the next morning. He explained how long it would take. He explained the maintenance requirements. He explained what the system would produce. He said the water output numbers, and one of the Valkyrie coordinators put her pen down on the table. "That's 3 times what we have now," she said. "Yes," the young engineer said. "We have been on rationing protocols for, 40 years," he said. "We know. The rationing protocols are in the plan. The new system is calibrated to address the deficit that was created during the Dominion restriction years and to provide sufficient surplus to prevent future rationing under normal conditions." The coordinator stared at him. "You calculated our rationing deficit," she said. "We calculated what was taken," he said. "The water system is part of what was taken. We are returning it." The coordinator looked at the map, at the points marked in red where the components would go, at the web of lines connecting them. She looked back at the young engineer. She did not say anything, but something in her face did. The young engineer understood what it meant. He gave her a small plain nod. Then he pointed to the next item on the map and continued explaining. The school was built on the 8th day. Tessie was not expecting it. She had been watching the larger work. The terraforming arrays going in on the stripped land in the southern continent. The orbital station assembling itself in sections with a speed that still astonished her every time she looked up. The medical facilities opening in 3 cities at the same time. Fully equipped, fully staffed, already seeing patients. The orbital station, she had been told, took 11 days to assemble from components on the freighters. 11 days. The Valkyrie equivalent had taken 9 years. She had been watching the large work, and so she almost missed the school. It was in a district of the capital city that had been bombed during the worst years. The buildings around it were still unrepaired. The Valkyrie rebuilding had been slow, constrained by the resource restrictions the Dominion had maintained through most of the last century. The district was not fully abandoned, but it was not well. It had the specific quality of a neighborhood that had once been something and was now reduced to its outline. The school was small. It was placed where a building had stood before the bombing. Human construction workers had cleared the site in a day and built the structure in 6. It was not large or grand. It was sized correctly for a neighborhood school, with rooms for children and a space outside for them to move around in. When Tessie came to see it, a human worker was finishing the entrance. He was placing a plaque beside the door. He secured it carefully. Then he stepped back and looked at it, and then turned and saw her. He said nothing. He seemed to understand who she was without being told, though she did not know how. He stepped to the side and let her look at the plaque. It was in old Valkyrie script, the same archaic dialect that the first transmission had used. The words were clear and plain. From the children of the 40,000. Tessie looked at the plaque for a long time. The construction worker waited quietly and did not rush her. She did not cry this time. She had done her crying. What she felt now was past the place where crying reached. She reached out and touched the plaque with 2 fingers, very briefly. Then she turned and walked back toward the ministry. She had work to do. There was a great deal of coordination still needed, and the irrigation systems were going in tomorrow. And someone needed to be present to confirm the placement was correct. She walked back with her hands clasped behind her and her face very still, and something in her chest that she thought would take some time to find the right words for. She was all right with that. Some things were bigger than quick words. Admiral Vial came to the Valkyrie homeworld on the 9th day. She came alone. No guard, no delegation, no formal announcement. She arrived in a small craft and was met by a single government aide who brought her to the ministry. Tessie was waiting. They sat in a room with 2 chairs and a low table, and a window looking out at the work happening in the southern district. From this distance, the terraforming arrays looked like lines of light written across the damaged land. Tessie had arranged tea, real Valkyrie tea, the traditional preparation, which took a long time and which she had made herself. Vial drank it with both hands around the cup, and her eyes going to the window every so often. "Your people work very quickly," Tessie said. "They want to," Vial said, "not because it is urgent, because they have wanted to do this for a long time." "How long?" Tessie asked. Vial thought about it. "The plan for the Valkyrie repayment was the first major project we completed after the initial settlement period," she said. "When we had enough stability to begin planning long-term, this was where we started." "How long ago was that?" About 270 years ago, Val said. Tessie sat with this for a moment. You have been planning this for 270 years, she said. Planning and building, Val said. We kept revising the plan. As we learned more, as our capabilities grew, we wanted to get it right. She looked at the window, at the lights on the broken land. We wanted to return what was actually taken, she said. Not a gesture, not a symbol, the actual amount, the actual things. It took time to calculate correctly. Tessie thought about a people in the dark, developing, growing, calculating, taking the time to do it right, because if you were going to do it, you did it right. Because a careful debt deserved a careful repayment. The school, Tessie said. Yes, Vale said. Where did the children of the 40,000 go? After they left here? Dark space, Vale said. We called it the Reach, a system of 6 worlds, unmapped, well away from the transit lanes. We built there. On 6 worlds, Vile said. We have more now. The Reach expanded. How many people? Tessie asked. Now, Vile looked at her cup. More than we arrived with, she said. It was not really an answer. Tessie understood it was not meant to be one. Not yet. That number, whatever it was a piece of information the galaxy would receive when it was useful for the galaxy to receive it. Can I ask you something? Tessie said. Yes, Vile said. Were you always going to come back? Val looked out the window for a long time. The lights of the terraforming arrays moved slowly across the damaged landscape. We built our first ship, she said, and named it after your world. She was quiet. We built our second ship and named it after your capital city. She looked at Tessie. After that, she said, it was not really a question. The room was quiet for a while after that, and not uncomfortably, the kind of quiet that comes when something important has been said and both people are letting it settle. Later, Tessie walked with her across the city, not a formal tour, just walking. Vielle had asked if she could see it, the real city, not the areas under active construction. Tessie had understood. They walked through the market district, which had recovered somewhat over the years. Stalls and small buildings, the daily trade of a civilization that had survived its reduction and was still here. People moved around them, and some of them recognized Tessie and nodded, and a few saw the human with her and looked, but not with fear. Something different. Something that had been shifted by 9 days of freighters and work, and a young engineer explaining water rationing deficits as if they were simply a problem with a solution. The Dominion, Tessie said as they walked. She did not phrase it as a question. It was just a word. Vale walked for a moment. Yes, she said. I heard about the homeworlds, Tessie said, that no one was hurt. We were not here to hurt people, Vale said. We have never been here to hurt people. But the infrastructure was the mechanism of harm, Vale said. We removed the mechanism. The people are on new worlds, smaller, less resourced. They will have to build. They will have difficulty. She stopped walking. She turned to look at a building on the side of the street. An old building, repaired in places with materials that did not quite match, which was how you could tell where the damage had been. So did we, she said. She said it quietly, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the flatness of a simple fact that had been lived and understood and filed. Tessie looked at the repaired building, at the places where the materials did not match. She had looked at those places for many years. She had stopped seeing them. She saw them now. The Keth people, she said. What happens to them? They rebuild, Vile said, without the Dominion structure, without the apparatus. Some of them will be fine. Some of them will struggle. The outer colony populations are resourceful. They know how to do without. She started walking again. Their entry in the ledger, she said, is now closed. Closed, Tessie said. Hey, the debt has been settled, Vile said. One way or another, it is settled. They are in the ledger as a settled account. We do not return to settled accounts. They walked in silence for a moment. That is mercy, Tessie said. Vale glanced at her sideways. That is accounting, she said. Tessie was quiet. She thought about the difference between the two things. She thought that maybe in the hands of people who were careful enough and patient enough, they might end up in the same place. On the 12th day, the medical facilities in all 3 cities were fully operational. On the 14th day, the first crops were seeded in the southern continent, in soil that the terraforming arrays had spent 6 days preparing. The soil readings were better than the Valkyrie Agricultural Ministry had projected for that land in any optimistic forecast. 3 different scientists sent Thessi messages about the soil readings. One of them used the word impossible, and then corrected himself in a second message and said he meant unprecedented. On the 15th day, the orbital station was completed. Human engineers gave the Valkyrie operations staff a 3-day handover and orientation. The station was not a human station with Valkyrie access. It was a Valkyrie station, built by humans, handed over completely. The deed of transfer was the most paperwork Thessi had signed in 20 years. She signed every page. On the 16th day, Val's small craft left the homeworld and returned to the fleet. Thessi stood at the window again. The freighters were still there, still working, still making their slow, organized passes over the landscape. The work was not done. It would take more weeks. But the southern continent's lights were different now. The lines of the terraforming arrays had settled into their operational pattern, a steady, regular movement across the land, doing the slow work of returning something to what it should be. Thessi watched them from the ministry window. Somewhere in that light, crops were seeded in prepared soil. Children would go to a school with a plaque above the door in a language their grandparents had stopped speaking because no one else knew it anymore. Water would flow somewhere it had not flowed in 40 years. She thought about 6 months of morning walks across a flat plain carrying blankets. She thought about 40,000 people in broken ships. She thought about what it was to carry something for 300 years and then come back and put it down properly. She put her hand on the window. Outside, the lights moved across the southern land, steady, unhurried, patient in the way of things that have all the time they need to do what they came to do. Thessi stood at the window for a very long time. The city behind her was already different than it had been 16 days ago. It would be more different in another 16. She was going to live long enough to see it. She was certain of that, and the certainty was not something she had felt before, and she did not examine it too carefully because some gifts are too large to hold directly. Because she just stood at the window and let the lights move across the land and breathed. The broadcast went out on a morning when the council station's corridors were already busy with more people than they were built for. Pavu arrived at his office early before most of his staff, a habit from the first years when his group was small, and he had learned that the quiet hours were the only ones you could actually think in. He made something warm in the small machine in the corner and sat at his desk and looked at the incoming messages, of which there were a great deal. He was on the 3rd message when the broadcast notification appeared at the top of his secondary screen. It said, "Simultaneous multi-channel transmission received from human fleet. All species, all standard frequencies. Text format." He opened it. He read it. He set down his cup. The ledger was public, not a summary, not a statement about it. The actual contents, every entry, every species, every column of numbers, every calculated figure, released simultaneously to every species in the Galactic Assembly, delivered in each species' own language, formatted clearly, organized by species. The methodology explained in plain language at the top, so that the numbers could be verified by anyone who wanted to check the work. There was no accompanying statement, no declaration, no demands, no deadline. Just the ledger, delivered to everyone at the same time, and the clean, quiet implication that everyone could now see their own number and everyone else's and draw their own conclusions. Pavu read through his own species entry. It was not long. It was accurate. He recognized several of the entries, specific decisions, specific moments he had been present for or had read about in his own government's records. They were listed without editorializing, without weight given to the politics around them, simply as actions taken or not taken. He looked at the total. Modest positive, slightly better than he had expected. His own world had, apparently, quietly done a few things right over the years that were in the ledger and not in their own official histories. He sat with that for a moment, the strange experience of being seen more completely than you knew. He thought about every other species representative on this station reading their own entry at the same moment. He thought about the private calculations being done in offices all across the council. He thought about what it meant to have your history summarized by someone who had no political reason to soften it. He thought, they did not have to make it public. They had already started delivering on the positive entries. The Haiyan delivery had happened. Other deliveries had happened quietly in the weeks since, to species with positive numbers. The negative entries, the Velnari bill, and others, had been presented to those species privately. Making it public was a separate choice. He thought about why you would make that choice. So everyone knows, he thought. So the positive entries are acknowledged publicly, not just received quietly. So the negative entries carry a weight that private billing does not. So every species in the galaxy can see the full picture and understand that the ledger is not a political tool. It is simply what happened, written down. The most powerful statement was not the debt collection, it was the transparency. This is what your history looks like when someone recorded it honestly, the broadcast said, without saying it. You may disagree with the methodology, you may dispute specific entries, but the methodology is there for you to check, and you will find it is sound. Pavu's comm system began making noise, every channel simultaneously. He let it make noise for a while, and finished his warm drink, and read through several other species entries in the ledger before he started answering. The council session that afternoon was not 11 hours. It was 3. 3 hours was all it took, because the release of the ledger had changed the shape of the conversation. People had stopped asking what was in it, and they now knew. The question was what to do with what they knew, and that question turned out to have a fairly clear answer once the noise cleared. The Velnari settlement had been agreed and signed that morning. The Velnari Council had been sitting on the bill for 3 weeks, and the public release of the ledger apparently resolved whatever hesitation had remained. 2 other species with negative entries submitted their proposed responses before the session began. Both proposals were measured and realistic, built around the settlement options the human envoys had offered, not improvised panic. Both proposals had clearly been worked on for some time. People were ready, Pavu observed, had been getting ready. The ledger's public release had simply removed the last reason to keep the preparations private. 3 hours, a record. And at the end of the session, Pavu proposed that the council formally invite a human representative to address the assembly. The motion passed by a significant margin. He sent the invitation to the Human Fleet's communications channel. He received a reply within the day. The invitation has been received and logged. A response will be provided. Not yes, not no. Logged. He understood by now that this was how they communicated intentions. Nothing was said that was not meant. Nothing was promised that was not certain. The word logged meant it had been received and would be addressed when addressing it was appropriate. He put it in his notes and moved on. On a neutral world in the outer reaches of Dominion-adjacent space, a young woman named Mira was watching the broadcast from a small apartment that overlooked a gray and unremarkable city. She was 23 years old. She worked in a records office. She had done this work for 2 years since finishing her studies, and she was good at it. Her real name was Mira Rockthal, but she had not used that name in public for 3 years, since her grandfather died, since the weight of it had stopped being something she could carry everywhere she went. She was watching the broadcast of the ledger's release. She had been watching everything related to the human fleet since they appeared, the way you watch something that was coming toward you and might or might not be coming toward you specifically. The Dominion entry was near the end of the ledger. It was long. She did not read all of it. She had grown up in the Dominion's administrative class. She knew enough of the history to understand the general shape of what the numbers meant. She did not need to read every line to understand it. She looked at the total at the bottom of the Dominion's entry. She sat with it for a long time. Then she closed the broadcast and went to work. She worked her regular shift. She filed her regular records. She had a meal in the office's small eating area with 2 colleagues who were also watching coverage of the broadcast and who talked about it in the careful way people talked about large things they did not know how to hold yet. She came home. She sat in her apartment and thought about her grandfather, about the things she had been told as a child and the things she had understood much later, as an adult, in the way understanding often worked. Not arriving all at once, but settling slowly over years, until one day it was just something you knew and could not unknow. She had spent 3 years building a quiet life under a different name. working in a records office, being ordinary. She had 3 weeks ago begun writing a message, had not sent it, had rewritten it several times. Tonight she finished it. It was not long. It asked one question. She sent it to the Human Fleet's communication channel, the public one that was listed in the diplomatic record. She did not expect a reply. She received an acknowledgement within the hour. Your message has been received. 3 days later, she received a follow-up. Admiral Vile will meet with you at the following station at the following time, if you are able. Mira sat with this for a long time, and then she booked her travel. The station Admiral Vile had named was a small one, a transit point, the kind of place where people passed through rather than stayed. It had a viewing lounge with a long window looking out at a quiet stretch of space, and it was here that Vale was waiting when Mira arrived. Vale was alone. No aide, no security, no delegation. Mira walked to the table. She sat down. She had rehearsed several openings. She had a question she had been carrying for 3 weeks. She had words prepared. She looked at Val. She said, "What happens to the negative numbers?" Val looked back at her. She looked at Mira the way she looked at things, completely without hurry. Mira had the specific experience of being seen clearly by someone who was not deciding what to do with what they saw, just seeing it accurately. And the silence lasted a few seconds. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of someone who understood precisely what was being asked. "You're not the Dominion," Vale said. "My name is—" "I know your name," Vale said. "Both of them." Mira was quiet. "You're not the Dominion," Vale said again, quieter this time, not as a statement about politics, as a statement about what she was looking at. "But the number," Mira started. "The Dominion's entry is closed," Vale said. "The account is settled." "The infrastructure—" "Gone," Vale said. "Yes, that is the settlement." "And the people? The Keth people on the New Worlds? They had nothing to do with—" "Some of them had nothing to do with it," Vale said. "Some of them did. The account is settled for all of them the same. The settlement was not designed to distinguish. The Dominion as an entity has a closed account. The people who came from it are individuals. Individuals have their own entries." She looked at Mira steadily. "Your entry," she said, "is not your grandfather's entry." Mira sat with this. "What is my entry?" she said. 3 years, Vale said. "You have been building something different for 3 years, under a different name, in a records office, doing ordinary work. There are people in your building who know you by your ordinary name and think of you as someone who keeps good records and is reliable and brings food to share sometimes." Mira did not ask how she knew this. She was past the point of asking how they knew things. "You asked a simple question," Vile said. "What happens to negative numbers?" Mira waited. "Numbers change," Vile said. She said it plainly, without comfort built into it, without the softness people put around things to make them easier to hold. Just the flat truth of it. Numbers change. Mira sat with this. It was the least reassuring reassurance she had ever received. It gave her no promise. It made no guarantee. It also did not close a door. "What does that mean practically?" she said. "It means," Vile said, "that the ledger is a living document." She stood. "New entries go in every day," she said. "Old entries are updated when circumstances change. The ledger is not a sentence. It is a record." She was preparing to leave. "Why did you agree to meet with me?" Mira said. Vale paused. "Because you asked," she said. "That's all?" "You asked honestly," Vale said. "You asked because you needed to know the answer. Not because you wanted to negotiate or to make a case or to get something. You just needed to know." She looked at her. "We always answer honest questions when we can," she said. She walked away. Mira sat in the viewing lounge for a long time after, looking out the window. The station was quiet. Occasionally a ship passed in the view outside. Numbers change. She thought about her records office, about her ordinary name, about 3 years of building something small and unremarkable. She thought about the ledger, about it being alive, about every day adding new entries. She thought about her grandfather and about the things she had spent 3 years not being. Numbers change. She picked up her bag and walked to the transit desk to book her way home. Pavu was at his viewport when the formal integration proposal was drafted. It had taken 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the fleet appeared, since the ledger was delivered publicly, since the Valkyrie work had begun, and the settlements had started coming in, and the council had shifted from panic to something that looked more like adaptation. The proposal was comprehensive. Humanity as a formal council member. Seats, representation, rights, obligations. A full integration framework developed by the council's best legal and diplomatic architects, the kind of document that would normally take a year to produce. 6 weeks. He had contributed to it himself. He thought it was good work. He thought it was fair. He sent it to the human fleet's communications channel and waited. The reply came the same day. The proposal has been received. We will consider it. Not yes, not no. Pavu looked at the reply for a moment. He thought about a ledger with worn corners, about a message in a dead dialect carried for 3 centuries, about a fleet that had stopped exactly at a border and waited 6 hours for an answer before moving 1 meter. He thought about people who had planned for 300 years, who did not hurry, who had decided early that patience was not a weakness, but a method. He put the reply in his files. He would wait. 3 weeks after the ledger's public release, a small story came through the General News Service. The Ha'an Space Authority had, in the previous month, reported several long-range anomalies near a dim star in the outer edge of their system. The star had been showing irregular readings for 40 years. It was not large enough or close enough to be dangerous, but it had been on the monitoring list for decades. The anomalies had resolved. The star's readings were now completely stable. The irregular patterns that had concerned astronomers for 40 years were gone. The Ha'an Space Authority issued a statement noting the anomaly's resolution and crediting it to natural stellar processes. A scientist on the independent news service posted a quiet counter-analysis. The natural stellar process explanation, she said, did not account for the specific nature of the resolution. What the instruments showed was not natural stabilization, but something that looked like intervention. Specifically, the kind of intervention that required a deep understanding of stellar dynamics and a significant capacity for precision work in a difficult environment. The kind of work that might take, she noted, roughly a decade to plan and execute. She also noted that the Ha'an had, 40 years ago, helped 11 humans who were hurt. The news service's comment section ran to several thousand entries. The Ha'an Authority declined to comment further. The human fleet declined to comment at all. The story was noted in council communications and flagged for Pavu's attention. He read it at his desk and did not add anything to the record. He thought about what it meant to stabilize a star, about the planning required, about the time, about the fact that it had been done a decade ago, in quiet and delivered without announcement, completed before the human fleet had even appeared in the outer dark. He thought about what other things had been done in quiet over the decades, uttered and delivered without announcement, and were simply waiting to be discovered. He thought about how long the Han would take to realize that the disease solutions in their data package had come with something else embedded in them. Not malware, not manipulation, just a deep biological understanding of their specific physiological structure that implied the humans had been studying Ha'an biology for a very long time. Carefully, respectfully, from a distance, because if you were going to repay a debt properly, you needed to know exactly what would be valuable to the people you owed. He did not know what else was out there, embedded quietly in the fabric of the galaxy, waiting. He suspected there was quite a lot of it. He was not sure whether that was frightening or something else. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. And that evening at the viewport in his quarters, he watched the ships. The human fleet had redistributed itself over the past 6 weeks, not concentrated in Valkyrie space anymore. That work was ongoing but no longer required the full fleet. The ships had spread into the lanes between systems, into the transit corridors, into the dark spaces between the recognized routes where no one had ever had reason to go before. Not blocking anything, not claiming anything, simply present, integrated into the space of the galaxy the way something integrates when it belongs there. Doru came to stand beside him. "Do you think they'll accept the membership proposal?" Doru said. "Eventually," Pavu said. "What are they waiting for?" Pavu thought about it. "They have the ledger," he said. They know everyone's history. Once they know who can be trusted and who is working toward trust and who has not started yet, he looked at the ships. They don't need to be inside the council to do what they're doing. Membership would give them certain obligations they don't currently have. They'll take those obligations when they're ready to have them. And in the meantime, Pavu said, they're doing what they came to do. He watched a ship move slowly through the far edge of his viewport's view. Large, unhurried, going somewhere specific with the certainty of something that has already decided where it is going. Do you think they'll stay? Doru said. Permanently, in galactic space. Pavu looked at the ships. He looked at the Velkari lights, visible as a faint glow at the edge of his view. The planet already different than it had been 2 months ago, already becoming what it should have been, all the quiet restitution of a careful debt. He thought about the harbor manifest, sanctuary granted, 300 years ago, one small act. He thought about a fleet that came out of the dark and stopped exactly at the border and waited to be asked before moving 1 meter inside. He thought about a plaque in an old dialect above a school door in a district that used to be rubble. They never left, he said. It was the truest thing he had said in weeks. Dora was quiet. Outside, the ships moved through the dark, patient, steady, distributed across the galaxy's lanes like something that had always been there and was only now visible. The galaxy breathed around them. Not the hell breath of the first weeks, or the gasping calculation of every species doing its private arithmetic. Something else now, something that was working out, slowly and imperfectly, what it meant to share a galaxy with people who kept records, who remembered small things, who carried debts and gifts alike across centuries and delivered them properly, without ceremony, because the delivery was the point and not the drama of it. Pavu stood at the viewport until the light-dimming cycle started in the corridor behind him. He thought about Mira in her records office under her ordinary name. He thought about Thessi at a window watching light move across restored land. He thought about Vosara with 40 years of impossible problems suddenly solved. He thought about a ledger with worn corners, handled so many times the binding had softened. He thought the galaxy feared them because the galaxy expected revenge, and what they brought instead was something the galaxy had no category for. They brought a reckoning that was also a gift. They brought an account that was also a homecoming. They brought 300 years of work aimed precisely at making things right, not making things even. That was the thing no one had prepared for. Not what they did, what they were. He stood at the viewport until the lights dimmed fully and the corridor went dark. Outside, the ships moved through the dark between the stars. Patient, present, home.